Mama, she understands you. The words didn't come from him, and that was the problem. They came from behind him, soft, steady, and wrapped in a perfect Italian accent that didn't belong in this room. The clink of crystal paused midair. A fork hovered inches above a plate. Even the violinist in the corner seemed to miss a note. For a brief, suspended second, the entire restaurant forgot how to breathe. Alexander Romano slowly turned his head, not out of curiosity, but control, the kind of control a man builds after years of owning every room he walks into. $500 million in recent acquisitions. A penthouse overlooking Central Park. A name that opened doors before he even reached them. He was used to being understood, followed, obeyed. But this wasn't part of his script. The private dining room at Bellucci sat 30 floors above Manhattan, wrapped in glass and gold, a place where conversations decided futures and silence carried weight. Tonight was supposed to be simple. A strategic dinner. A quiet negotiation. And most importantly, time with the one person Alexander never rushed for anyone, his mother. Isabella Romano sat at the center of the table, elegant and composed, her silver hair pinned neatly, her eyes observant but distant, as if she were listening to a world no one else could hear. She had spoken little since arriving from Florence 2 days ago. Not because she had nothing to say, but because most people stopped trying to understand her after the first sentence. Around the table, men in tailored suits leaned in, speaking rapid Italian, confident in their privacy, confident that language itself was a wall. Numbers were mentioned. Margins. Influence. And in between, quiet remarks slipped through, the kind that didn't need to be loud to carry meaning. A comment about service staff. A chuckle about who belongs in rooms like this. Alexander didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. This was how power sounded when it was comfortable. And then there was her. Naomi Carter moved through the room like she had learned long ago that being unnoticed was its own kind of safety. Black uniform, pressed and simple. Hair tied back. Steps measured. She poured water, adjusted plates, nodded politely when addressed, and disappeared just as quickly. To most, she was part of the background. Necessary, but irrelevant. Invisible, but present. She had heard it all. Not just tonight, but every night. The tones, the assumptions, the way people lowered their voices just enough to pretend respect. But tonight, something shifted. It wasn't the words. It was Isabella. Naomi noticed the older woman's hands, the slight hesitation when she tried to respond, the way her eyes softened when no one understood her. It was a look Naomi recognized. Not confusion. Not weakness. Just isolation wrapped in dignity. And then, without asking permission, without announcing herself, Naomi stepped closer. She didn't address the table. She didn't look at Alexander. She looked at Isabella. And she spoke. Fluent. Gentle. Precise. Italian, not as a performance, but as a bridge. Isabella's eyes widened, not in shock, but in recognition. Something familiar. Something warm. A language that didn't need translation. And in that moment, something invisible cracked. Not glass. Not power. But distance. Across the table, Alexander Romano felt it before he understood it. The shift. The loss of control. Because for the first time that night, the most important conversation in the room wasn't his. Alexander did not speak right away, and that alone was enough to unsettle the table because men like him filled silence on instinct. They shaped it, controlled it, used it like a tool, but this silence did not belong to him, it belonged to the quiet exchange happening just a few feet away, where Naomi Carter stood with calm posture and steady eyes, speaking to Isabella Romano as if the rest of the room had faded into nothing more than distant noise, her voice low and warm, her Italian not just correct but lived in, shaped by rhythm and memory rather than textbooks, and Isabella responded, slowly at first, then with growing ease, her hands relaxing on the edge of the table, her shoulders softening, her voice gaining a lightness that had been missing all evening, the kind of lightness that comes when someone finally feels understood without effort, without explanation, without being reduced to short translated sentences that stripped away meaning. And for the first time since arriving in New York, she was not adapting, she was simply being herself, and that shift was impossible to ignore. Alexander's gaze moved from his mother to Naomi and back again, studying not just the words but the space between them, the invisible thread forming in real time, something unspoken but undeniable, something that had nothing to do with business, leverage, or negotiation, the things he had spent his entire life mastering, and everything to do with presence, something far rarer in rooms like this. Across the table one of his associates cleared his throat, attempting to redirect attention, bringing up figures, projections, the safe language of control, but the words landed flat, like echoes in a room that had already moved on, because the center had shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely, and Alexander felt it in a way that unsettled him more than any direct challenge ever could. He was not being confronted, he was being bypassed, and that was new, that was unfamiliar. Naomi did not rush, she did not perform, she did not look around for approval, she simply listened, nodded, responded, her tone adjusting naturally to Isabella's cadence, respectful without being distant, warm without being intrusive, and there was a detail that caught Alexander off guard. She did not simplify her language, she did not speak as if explaining. She spoke as if sharing, as if the woman across from her was not someone fragile or out of place, but someone worthy of full conversation, full presence, full respect, and Isabella noticed that too. Her eyes glistened slightly, not from sadness, but recognition, the kind that comes when dignity is returned without being asked for. A small smile formed at the corner of her lips as she said something softly in Italian, and Naomi responded with a quiet laugh, the kind that belonged more to a kitchen table than a five-star restaurant, and suddenly the distance between past and present seemed to shrink. Alexander leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers resting against the stem of his glass. Untouched, his expression composed but his mind moving faster than usual, recalibrating, trying to understand how a woman he had not noticed 10 minutes ago had just altered the emotional gravity of the entire room without raising her voice, without asking for attention, without stepping outside the role everyone had assigned to her. And yet she had stepped outside of it completely, not by rejecting it, but by expanding it beyond what anyone expected. One of the men beside him finally spoke, a quiet remark in Italian, half amused, half dismissive, suggesting that perhaps she had picked up a few phrases, a trick, a coincidence, something easy to explain, something that would restore order. But before the idea could settle, Naomi answered, still facing Isabella, still calm, her response fluid, layered, unmistakably fluent, not just in language, but in meaning, and the attempt to reduce her dissolved instantly, replaced by a silence far heavier than before, because now it was not curiosity filling the room, it was realization. And Alexander Romano, a man who built his empire on knowing exactly who he was dealing with at all times, realized in that moment that he had completely misread the most important person in the room, not the investors, not the partners, not even himself, but the woman who had just given his mother something no amount of money had managed to buy in years, the simple, profound comfort of being understood. It was Isabella who reached for Naomi's hand, not with urgency, but with intention, her fingers resting lightly against Naomi's wrist as she spoke again, slower this time, her Italian carrying the softness of memory rather than the precision of conversation, and Naomi listened without interrupting, her head slightly tilted, her expression attentive in a way that could not be taught, only lived. And when she answered, her voice lowered just enough to match the intimacy of the moment, as if the language itself required respect, as if it carried something fragile between every word. And across the table Alexander felt something unfamiliar press against his chest, not discomfort, not anger, but something quieter, something harder to define. Because he was watching his mother come alive in a way he had not seen in years, not during board meetings, not during family gatherings, not even during their private dinners in Florence, where conversations often stayed polite, contained, translated, reduced, and he realized, with a clarity that unsettled him, that he had mistaken silence for peace, that he had believed comfort was something he could provide through access, through luxury, through control, but what he was seeing now had nothing to do with any of that. It was connection, simple and direct, and it was happening without him. One of the investors shifted in his seat, glancing between Alexander and Naomi, unsure whether to interrupt or observe, because the rules of the room had changed without announcement, and no one was certain who was setting them anymore. Alexander finally leaned forward, his voice calm but deliberate as he spoke in Italian. addressing Naomi for the first time, asking where she had learned to speak like that, the question simple on the surface, but layered with something deeper, something closer to a test than curiosity, and Naomi turned toward him slowly, not startled, not intimidated, just aware, her posture unchanged, her eyes steady as she met his gaze, and when she answered, she did not rush, she did not soften her tone, she simply spoke, explaining that she had lived with her grandmother for several years. A woman from Naples who had never fully learned English, a woman who believed language was not just words, but respect, and Naomi had learned because she needed to, because understanding someone was not optional when they were your world. Her voice did not rise, did not perform, it stayed grounded, real, and something in the way she said it made the room feel smaller, quieter, as if the scale of the conversation had shifted from millions of dollars to something far more human. Isabella smiled again, this time wider, her hand tightening gently around Naomi's fore. A brief second before releasing, and she said something that made Naomi's expression soften in return, something personal, something that did not need translation, but Alexander asked anyway, his voice lower now. Less commanding, more careful, and Naomi translated, her words simple, clear. She said you remind her of home, and that sentence landed heavier than any negotiation point discussed that evening, because home was not something Alexander had been able to give her, not fully, not in the way that mattered, and he knew it, even if he had never said it out loud. The room remained silent, not out of obligation, but because no one wanted to break whatever this was, and for the first time in a long time, Alexander did not try to control it. He watched it, studied it, allowed it to unfold without interference, and in doing so, he saw Naomi differently, not as staff, not as background, but as someone who had stepped into a space no one else in the room had even noticed was empty, and filled it without asking for permission, without needing recognition, and that realization settled into him slowly, like a truth that had been waiting to be seen, patient, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. The waiter standing near the entrance hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to step forward and resume service or wait for a signal that never came, because something invisible had taken priority in the room, something no protocol had prepared him for, and Naomi sensed it too, the subtle shift where attention no longer belonged to the table as a whole but to a single thread of connection that had quietly taken center stage. And instead of pulling away, instead of retreating back into the safety of routine, she remained present just a second longer than expected, not out of boldness, but because Isabella had not let go of her attention, her eyes still warm, still engaged, as if the conversation had only just begun, and Naomi responded with another sentence in Italian, softer this time, more personal, her tone carrying a familiarity that did not feel rehearsed, and Isabella's expression changed again. This time deeper, more reflective, her gaze drifting slightly as if the words had opened a door to somewhere far beyond the glass walls of Bellucci's, somewhere older, quieter, filled with narrow streets and afternoon light, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a tremor not of weakness but of memory, and Naomi listened carefully, nodding once before answering in a way that made Isabella let out a gentle breath she did not realize she had been holding. Across the table Alexander noticed that detail, the breath, the release, the way his mother's posture softened in a way he had not seen in years, and it struck him with a quiet force that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with realization. Because for all his resources, for all his reach, he had not been able to create that moment for her, not intentionally, not consistently, and yet Naomi had done it without planning, without effort, simply by seeing what others had overlooked. One of the men at the table finally attempted to re-enter the conversation, offering a polite comment about the menu, about the wine selection, about anything that could bring the evening back to its original purpose, but the words felt misplaced, like they belonged to a different room, a different night, and Alexander did not respond. He did not acknowledge the attempt. His focus remained where it had shifted, fixed on Naomi, studying not just what she said but how she carried herself, the absence of hesitation, the lack of self-consciousness, the quiet confidence that did not need to announce itself, and for a man who had built his instincts on reading people quickly and accurately, this was unfamiliar territory. Because she did not fit any of the patterns he relied on, she was not trying to impress, not trying to avoid attention, not trying to negotiate her place, she simply occupied it, naturally, and that made her impossible to categorize. Naomi then stepped back slightly, not to withdraw, but to allow space, her role reappearing on the surface as she reached for the water pitcher, refilling Isabella's glass with the same steady hands, the same composed expression, as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. And yet everything had, and that contrast did not escape Alexander. The ease with which she moved between invisibility and impact, between service and presence, without either diminishing the other, and Isabella watched her as she moved, her gaze following not with curiosity but with appreciation, the kind reserved for something rare, something meaningful, and she said one more sentence, softer now, almost private, and Naomi paused, just long enough to hear it fully, before answering with a quiet warmth that carried both understanding and respect, and when she turned to step away, Alexander spoke again, this time not in Italian, not in the language of control or tradition, but in English, clear and direct, asking her name. And the question landed differently than before. Not as a test, not as a challenge, but as an acknowledgement, and Naomi met his gaze once more, her voice calm, her answer simple, Naomi, and for a brief moment that name seemed to settle into the room with more weight than any title had carried that evening, because it was no longer about roles or positions or expectations, it was about presence, and Alexander realized, perhaps for the first time that night, that the most valuable thing in the room was not what had been planned, negotiated, or controlled, but what had been seen, heard, and understood without anyone asking for it. The room did not return to normal, not fully, even as plates were adjusted and glasses were refilled, because something had already shifted beneath the surface, something that could not be undone by routine, and Alexander felt it in the way conversations resumed with a slight hesitation, as if everyone present was recalibrating their place in a dynamic that no longer followed the expected hierarchy. He leaned back once more, but this time his posture carried less certainty and more observation. His eyes following Naomi as she moved across the room, not with the dismissive glance he might have given earlier, but with focused attention, the kind he reserved for details that mattered, and what he noticed unsettled him in a quiet, persistent way. She did not change after being seen, she did not adjust her pace or posture, did not seek acknowledgement or retreat from it, she simply continued, consistent, composed, as if the moment that had just altered the energy of the entire evening was not something she needed to hold on to, and that restraint, that lack of performance, carried more weight than any display ever could. Across the table Isabella spoke again, this time in English, her voice gentle but clearer than before, asking Alexander a simple question about the city, about whether he had time to walk with her the next day, and he answered, but his response was slower than usual, his attention divided, because part of him was still processing what had just happened, still trying to understand how something so small, so quiet, had revealed something so significant. One of the men beside him attempted once more to steer the conversation back to business, referencing timelines and projections, but even he seemed less confident now, as if aware that the room no longer belonged entirely to numbers, and Alexander finally responded, but not with the same sharp precision he was known for, his tone measured, almost distant, as if the conversation had become secondary, because it had, at least for him. And when Naomi returned to the table with a fresh bottle of water, Alexander spoke again, this time more directly, asking how long she had worked there, the question simple, almost ordinary, but it carried a different intention now, not to assess, not to categorize, but to understand, and Naomi answered without hesitation, her voice steady, explaining that she had been there for just over a year, balancing shifts while taking classes during the day, her words straightforward, without embellishment, without seeking sympathy or admiration, and that detail landed differently than anything else she had said, because it added dimension, context, a life beyond the uniform, and Alexander nodded slightly, absorbing it, not as a fact to store, but as a perspective to reconsider. Isabella watched the exchange quietly, her expression thoughtful, and then she said something softly in Italian, her tone carrying a note of approval, something that made Naomi's lips curve into a small, genuine smile. And Alexander did not ask for a translation this time, not immediately, because he understood enough from the tone, from the expression, from the shift in his mother's presence, and that understanding did not come from language, it came from attention, from finally seeing what had been there all along. And as Naomi stepped away once more, moving back into the rhythm of the restaurant, Alexander realized that the evening he had planned so carefully, the outcomes he had calculated so precisely, were no longer the most important thing happening in that room, because something far less predictable had taken place, something that could not be negotiated or controlled, something that had quietly redefined value in a way he had not anticipated, and for the first time in a long time. He did not try to regain control of the narrative, he allowed it to unfold, uncertain, unfinished, and deeply real. By the time the main course arrived, the rhythm of the evening had changed in a way no one could formally acknowledge, but everyone could feel. The conversations that once flowed with sharp intent now carried pauses, subtle glances, moments of quiet recalibration, and Alexander noticed how often his attention drifted away from the discussion at hand, drawn instead to the edges of the room where Naomi moved with the same quiet consistency, as if untouched by the shift she had created, and that contrast stayed with him, because he had spent years watching people change the moment they were noticed, adjusting their tone, their posture, their ambition, but Naomi did none of that. She remained exactly as she had been, and that made her presence feel even more deliberate, even more grounded. Isabella, meanwhile, seemed lighter, her engagement with the table no longer forced or filtered. She spoke more, asked questions, even laughed softly at one point, and each time she did, her eyes would briefly follow Naomi's movement across the room, as if anchoring herself to something familiar, something steady, and Alexander saw it, not just as a son, but as a man who had built his identity on solving problems, optimizing outcomes, controlling variables, and yet here was something he had not anticipated, a variable he had not accounted for, a human connection that operated outside of his systems, outside of his influence. One of the investors attempted once more to bring the conversation back to a critical point, referencing a deadline that required Alexander's immediate input, and this time Alexander responded, but his answer lacked its usual finality. Instead of closing the topic, he left it open, his tone measured, almost reflective, as if he was no longer interested in ending conversations quickly, but in understanding them more fully, and that subtle shift did not go unnoticed. The others exchanged brief glances, sensing that something in his approach had changed, though none could name it. When Naomi returned again, this time to clear a plate near Isabella, the older woman spoke to her once more in Italian, her voice warm, almost affectionate now, and Naomi responded with the same ease, the same quiet fluency, and there was a moment, brief but unmistakable, where Isabella reached out again, this time not just in conversation, but in gratitude, her hand lightly touching Naomi's arm, and Naomi did not pull away. She simply nodded, her expression soft, acknowledging something deeper than words, and Alexander felt that moment settle into him with a clarity that cut through everything else, because gratitude was not something his world operated on easily, not in its pure form, not without expectation or transaction, and yet here it was, simple, unguarded, real. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table, and for the first time that evening, he spoke not to direct, not to control, but to share, his voice quieter now, less performative. As he addressed Naomi again, asking what she studied during the day, the question carrying genuine curiosity rather than evaluation, and Naomi answered just as simply, explaining that she was studying linguistics and cultural communication, that she wanted to work in spaces where language was not a barrier but a bridge, and the words landed with a quiet weight, because they reflected exactly what she had done without announcing it, without claiming it. She had bridged something that no one else in the room had even recognized as broken, and Alexander nodded slowly, not just acknowledging her answer, but absorbing its implication. Across from him, Isabella watched the exchange with a knowing expression, one that carried both pride and something else, something closer to relief, as if she had been waiting for this moment, not for Naomi to speak, but for Alexander to finally listen, and in that realization, the room felt different again, not louder, not brighter, but more honest, as if the layers that usually defined it had been quietly peeled back, revealing something simpler beneath, something that did not depend on status or power. And as Naomi stepped away once more, disappearing into the movement of the restaurant, Alexander remained still for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze lingering not on where she had gone, but on what she had left behind, a shift in perspective that could not be undone, a question he had not known to ask, and an answer he could not ignore. The dessert arrived, but no one reached for it right away, not because they were full, but because the evening had already offered something more filling than anything on the table, something that lingered in the air between them, subtle but undeniable, and Alexander noticed how even the smallest sound seemed sharper now, the gentle clink of a spoon against porcelain, the low hum of conversation from the dining room beyond the glass walls, the soft shift of Isabella's chair as she leaned slightly forward, her attention once again drawn to the space where Naomi had just been, and there was a quiet anticipation in her posture, as if she expected something more, not from the evening, but from the connection that had already begun, and that expectation did not feel misplaced, it felt earned. Alexander followed her gaze instinctively, his own attention now aligned with hers in a way it had not been before. And when Naomi reappeared, carrying a small tray with coffee service, the movement was simple, routine, but the effect was not, because now she was no longer invisible, not to him, not to anyone at the table, and yet she did not acknowledge that shift. She did not slow down or change her expression, she simply approached with the same calm presence, placing the cups with careful precision, her hand steady, her movements efficient, and when she reached Isabella, she paused just slightly longer, not enough to disrupt the flow, but enough to recognize the person, and Isabella smiled before a single word was spoken, as if greeting someone familiar rather than someone she had met only an hour ago, and she spoke again in Italian, her voice carrying warmth and something deeper, something that sounded like appreciation, and Naomi responded just as naturally, her tone soft but assured, and there was a rhythm between them now, a back and forth that did not need translation, that did not need explanation. It simply existed, and Alexander listened, not for the words, but for what they carried, the ease, the trust, the absence of distance, and he realized that what he was witnessing was not just communication, it was recognition, one human being seeing another fully, without filter, without assumption, and that realization settled into him with a quiet intensity, because it challenged something fundamental, something he had built his life around, the idea that value had to be proven, demonstrated, earned through visible markers, but Naomi had done none of that. She had not presented credentials, had not positioned herself, had not asked to be seen, and yet she had become the most significant presence in the room, not by force, but by truth. One of the men at the table finally attempted a light comment, something about unexpected talents, his tone casual but edged with a hint of disbelief, as if trying to reduce the moment to something easier to process, something that fit within familiar boundaries, but Alexander did not respond, not immediately, because he understood now that what had happened could not be simplified. It was not about talent alone, it was about attention, about care, about the willingness to step into someone else's world without needing recognition for it, and that distinction mattered, more than he had realized. Isabella then reached for her coffee, her hand steady, her expression peaceful, and she said something one last time to Naomi, her voice softer now, almost reflective, and Naomi listened closely, her head tilting slightly as she absorbed every word, and when she answered, her voice carried a warmth that lingered even after the sentence ended, and Alexander did not need a translation this time, he understood enough. Not through language, but through presence, and as Naomi stepped back, preparing to move on to the next table, he spoke, his voice clear but quieter than before, not to command, not to direct, but to acknowledge, and the words came without calculation, without strategy, simply as they were, honest and unguarded. "Thank you," and for a brief moment, Naomi paused, just long enough to meet his gaze, her expression unchanged but her eyes reflecting a quiet understanding, and then she nodded once. Not as a response to authority, but as a recognition between equals, before turning and continuing on, leaving behind a silence that felt different from all the others that night, not empty, not uncertain, but full, as if something important had just been said without needing to be repeated. By the time the final plates were cleared, the city outside had shifted into a deeper shade of night, the lights of Manhattan stretching endlessly beyond the glass like a quiet reminder of how vast the world was beyond this single room, and yet for Alexander, the entire evening had narrowed into something far more specific, something he could not quite step away from, even as the dinner drew toward its natural conclusion. The conversations around him had softened into polite closings. Handshakes prepared, agreements loosely acknowledged, but none of it held the same weight it had when the night began, because something else had already taken its place, something that could not be written into contracts or measured in numbers. Isabella sat calmly, her hands resting lightly on the table, her expression peaceful in a way that felt new, or perhaps simply forgotten, and every now and then her gaze would drift toward the dining room. Not searching, not expecting, but remembering. And Alexander noticed that, the quiet contentment that had replaced the earlier distance, and he understood, not intellectually, but instinctively, that this shift mattered more than anything they had discussed. One by one, the men at the table began to rise, offering closing remarks, polite gratitude, the kind of language that wrapped up an evening without revealing what had truly happened beneath it, and Alexander stood as well, his posture composed, his tone steady as he acknowledged each of them, but there was a subtle difference now. A restraint where there had once been dominance, a presence that did not need to assert itself, because something inside him had already adjusted, when the last of the guests stepped away, leaving only the quiet hum of the restaurant and the distant rhythm of the city below. Alexander turned back toward his mother, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was no need to fill the silence. Not this time. Isabella looked at him with a softness that carried both gratitude and understanding, and she said something in Italian, her voice gentle, familiar, and Alexander listened without interrupting, without asking for translation, because he understood enough now, not every word, but the meaning behind them, the tone, the feeling, the truth that had been present all evening, and he nodded slowly, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than any agreement he had made that night, and then, almost without thinking, his gaze moved again, scanning the room until it found her. Naomi was near the far side of the dining floor, speaking quietly with another staff member, her posture unchanged, her presence just as grounded as before, and for a moment, he simply watched, not with curiosity, not with analysis, but with recognition. The kind that comes when something shifts inside you and you cannot return to the way you saw things before. He walked toward her, not quickly, not with urgency, but with intention, each step measured, each movement deliberate, and when he reached her, he did not stand above her, did not create distance, he simply stood there, close enough to be heard, and Naomi turned, meeting his gaze with the same calm steadiness she had carried all evening, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, because the moment did not require immediate words. It required presence, and then Alexander said it, not as a line, not as a performance, but as a truth that had formed quietly over the course of the night. You gave her something I could not, his voice low, even, free of pride, free of hesitation, and Naomi listened. Her expression unchanged but attentive, and she answered just as simply, her tone soft but certain. I just spoke her language, and that answer settled between them with a clarity that needed no further explanation, because it was not about language at all, it was about seeing, about listening, about meeting someone where they truly were. And Alexander felt that understanding settle into him fully now, not as a passing thought, but as something deeper, something that would remain long after the night ended, and as Naomi nodded once more and stepped back into her work, the space she left behind felt different, not empty, but complete, as if the lesson had already been given, quietly, without demand, and fully received. The elevator ride down was quiet, but not empty, the kind of quiet that holds meaning rather than absence, and Alexander stood beside his mother with his hands resting loosely at his sides, no phone in his hand, no messages checked, no calls made, which in itself was unusual, because he was a man who filled every second with motion, with decisions, with control, but tonight something had slowed, something had shifted its pace inside him, and Isabella noticed it, not through words, but through presence. She glanced at him once, her eyes soft, her expression knowing, and she said something in Italian, her voice calm, steady, familiar, and Alexander listened without interruption, without needing every word to understand the meaning, because he understood enough now, not through translation, but through connection, through the same kind of attention he had watched Naomi offer without effort, and he nodded, not as a response, but as an acknowledgement, a quiet agreement that did not need to be spoken aloud. When the doors opened into the lobby, the world returned in small ways, the distant sound of traffic, the low murmur of voices, the polished floor reflecting the city lights just beyond the glass entrance, but even as they stepped out into that familiar rhythm, something remained different, something internal, something that would not reset with the next meeting or the next deal. Outside, the night air carried a cool edge, the kind that made people walk a little faster, think a little clearer, and as the car pulled up, the driver stepping out to open the door, Alexander paused for just a second, his gaze lifting toward the skyline, not as a man measuring opportunity, but as someone reconsidering perspective, and that pause, brief as it was, held more weight than any decision he had made that evening. Isabella settled into the seat beside him, her posture relaxed, her expression peaceful, and as the car began to move, she reached over lightly, placing her hand over his for just a moment, not to guide, not to correct, but simply to connect, and Alexander did not pull away, he did not shift, he let the moment remain, and in that stillness, he realized something that had been forming quietly throughout the night, something simple but undeniable, that power had never been the ability to control every outcome, it had been the ability to see what mattered when it appeared, even if it came from a place he had never thought to look. The city lights passed in a blur outside the window, reflections shifting across the glass, and for once, Alexander was not thinking about the next step, the next move, the next advantage. He was thinking about a voice, soft but certain, about a presence that had required no permission, about a moment that had changed the direction of an entire evening without raising its volume. And he understood now that what had stayed with him was not the language itself, not the fluency or the precision, but the intention behind it, the choice to meet someone where they were, fully, without condition, without expectation, and that realization settled into him with a clarity that felt both new and long overdue. As the car slowed at a red light, he spoke quietly, almost to himself, but not entirely. She did not just speak Italian, and Isabella turned her head slightly, her eyes attentive, and he continued, his voice steady, grounded in something deeper than observation. She spoke to you in a way I have not in years, and there was no defensiveness in his tone, no attempt to soften the truth, just an acknowledgement, honest and complete, and Isabella's expression did not change dramatically. She simply smiled, a small, warm smile that carried both acceptance and understanding, because she had known it long before he said it. And as the light turned green and the car moved forward again, Alexander leaned back slightly, his gaze steady, his mind clear in a way that did not come from certainty, but from awareness, and somewhere between the silence and the motion, between what had been said and what had not, the lesson settled fully into place. Quiet, firm, and impossible to ignore. That night he had walked into a room believing he owned it, but he left understanding something far more valuable, that true presence is not claimed, it is felt, and the person with the least power on paper can sometimes be the one who changes everything without ever needing to prove it.